The snow had started early that year, brushing rooftops and clinging to street lamps like a hush whispered over the city. At Mercy General Hospital, it meant a flurry of admittances, exhausted staff, and a kind of quiet chaos that wrapped around every shift like a second skin. Clara Hale arrived just before dawn, coffee in hand, scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon caught in wind. She was a nurse of 7 years, steady and unassuming, with eyes that noticed everything and a heart that refused to harden. She'd lost her mother to cancer the winter she graduated nursing school, and the grief never quite left her. It just softened, folded into the way she held a hand longer than necessary, or how she sat beside patients even after her shift ended. That morning, as she walked briskly past the ER and through the double doors of the ICU, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She ignored it. She had 12 hours of caring ahead, and texts could wait. It wasn't until 30 minutes into her shift, while checking vitals on a teenager with pneumonia, that the call came overhead. ICU charged to Trauma Bay. Emergency O-neg needed. Repeat, O-negative blood urgently required. Clara paused, fingers resting on the boy's wrist. Her heart thudded once, low and solid. She was O-negative. Without hesitation, she slipped from the room, murmured something to the other nurse on duty, and made her way to the blood bank. The head nurse was already coordinating donations. "Clara, you sure?" her colleague asked, scanning the clipboard. "You just started your shift." "I'm sure," Clara said gently. "If they need it now, there's no one else. Go ahead." 20 minutes later, she was reclined in a curtained room, the antiseptic sting of the needle dulling into a quiet ache. She rested her head back and closed her eyes, unaware of whose life she was tethered to by a slim red thread. All she knew was that someone was bleeding, and she had enough to give. The man had come in half-frozen, blood-soaked, without ID. Found slumped beside a wrecked black SUV halfway down a ravine, the snow still falling in hushes. The rescue team said he'd been driving alone. He wasn't wearing gloves, his fingertips were gray. The paramedics thought he wouldn't make it to the ER. But he had. 3 surgeons worked to repair the abdominal damage, the internal bleeding, the shattered ribs. His chest had bruised in patterns that suggested the steering wheel caught him hard. Every vitals monitor in the trauma unit had screamed red. And still he held on. By the time he stabilized, the snow outside had grown thick and quiet. Clara returned to her duties, her arm bandaged, her body tired but steady. She didn't ask about the patient she'd donated to. That wasn't the point. He was a stranger, someone the world hadn't finished with yet. The man didn't wake for 3 days. He opened his eyes slowly, lids fluttering like the snow on the windowsill beside his room. He was alone. The room hummed low with machines, soft beeping, a drip in his arm. Tubes ran from his side. His mouth was dry. His voice, when he finally used it, was hoarse and low, but it held weight. "Who stayed with me?" The night nurse, startled from her chair, lined in. "I'm sorry." "Someone," he rasped, throat catching. "I felt someone here when I was gone who stayed with me." The nurse glanced toward the chart, flipping pages with uncertain fingers. "You've been sedated for a while. We're not sure who found you exactly. You were brought in unconscious." The man didn't respond. His eyes drifted to the window, unfocused. There was a tremble in his hands, not fear, not quite, something quieter. The kind of tremble that only came from being ripped out of a life you hadn't quite wanted to return to. "His name was Ilyas Wren." That detail emerged slowly, as did the realization of who he was. Billionaire tech investor, founder of Wren Systems, recluse for the last 4 years, seen only in passing, always in black suits and surrounded by handlers. His reappearance, half dead, alone, far from any known address, stirred questions the hospital staff were smart enough not to ask aloud. Clara didn't know any of this when she stepped into his room 3 days later to check his IV. She had been reassigned to his care without much thought. The nurse manager simply said he needed a calm presence, someone intuitive. Clara had nodded, as she always did. She didn't seek out special cases, but when they came to her, she gave everything. She stepped into the room with quiet footsteps, clipboard in hand. Elias turned his head slowly. He had the kind of face that looked carved from quiet anger, sharp jaw, deep-set eyes, hair curling slightly against the gauze at his temple. His gaze settled on her with startling clarity. "You stayed," he said, "not a question. A statement filled with gravity." Clara blinked, her voice soft. "I'm sorry." His voice was rough. "The nurse who stayed, it was you." She hesitated, unsure what he meant. "I wasn't in the room with you, not until now." He studied her, eyes dark and unyielding, then said, "You gave me your blood." Clara stilled. She hadn't expected him to know. "That wasn't important," she said gently. "You needed it, I had it, that's all." It's not all, he said, you brought me back. Clara shifted her weight. She wasn't used to attention like this, especially not from patients. She made a note on her chart and kept her voice even. You were already fighting to stay alive, I just helped the odds a little. But he didn't look away. There was something haunted in his expression, something brittle. He had lived through a crash that could have ended him, woken in a hospital alone. And now, for reasons Clara couldn't begin to guess, he was staring at her like she was the first light in a long, dark tunnel. I want to know your name, Ilya said. She looked up. Why? Because I remember pain, he murmured, and I remember warmth. I don't want to forget the only good part of that night. Clara hesitated, then said quietly, Clara Hale. He repeated it once like a vow. Later, she'd learned that the only reason the news hadn't already swarmed the hospital was because of the sheer reach of his lawyers. Wren Systems kept everything sealed. Clara wouldn't find out until much later who he really was. For now, he was just Ilya's, the man with eyes that never settled, a voice full of weight, and a hunger for silence that Clara instinctively understood. She adjusted his blanket, checked his IV, and turned to leave. Will you come back tomorrow? He asked, voice low, almost uncertain. She looked over her shoulder. I'm your nurse, she said with a faint smile. Of course I will. He watched her go, and in the stillness that followed, his hand curled slightly on the blanket, like he was trying to hold on to something he didn't yet understand. Ilya's didn't sleep that night. The hospital quieted after midnight, lights dimmed, voices hushed, but his mind refused to follow. He lay still, watching the faint shadow of the IV pole stretch across the floor with every passing hour. His body ached, stitched and bruised, yet it was the silence inside his own thoughts that felt most unfamiliar. He had lived years without needing anyone, had pulled away from the public, from boardrooms, from faces that smiled too easily and spoke in rehearsed tones. His world had narrowed to numbers, contracts, walls that no one could climb. And now, a stranger had given him her blood, and it had done something that frightened him more than the accident itself. It had made him feel tethered again. The next morning, Clara came in with her usual quiet efficiency. No makeup, hair loosely pinned, the corners of her scrub top slightly worn from too many washes. She moved like someone used to being invisible, which made her all the more impossible to ignore. Ilyas watched her from his bed as she checked his vitals. She didn't speak right away. She seemed to sense he wasn't ready for that. Instead, she gently adjusted his oxygen tubing and frowned at the numbers on the monitor. You didn't rest, she said softly. I'm not good at sleeping when things are out of my control. She didn't flinch at the honesty. Instead, she folded her arms and said, You're healing. That's the only thing that matters right now. Elias looked at her hands. They were steady, clean, a faint bruise from the blood draw still visible in the crook of her elbow. You didn't have to do what you did, he said. I know. Then why did you? She hesitated, then sat gently in the chair beside his bed. Because someone needed it, and because I've been on the other side of this room, watching someone fade while hoping a stranger somewhere might be kind enough to help. He was quiet, someone you lost. She nodded. My mom, 8 years ago. She was in this same wing actually, different room. Elias looked at her differently then, as if something invisible had shifted between them. He didn't say he was sorry. Instead, he let the silence stretch, respectful and full. You don't talk much, Clara said eventually. I used to, Elias replied, before I realized most people only hear what they want to. Clara gave a small, knowing smile. Then maybe you were talking to the wrong people. In the days that followed, their conversation deepened in fragments. Clara never asked why he had no visitors. She didn't press when she saw the private security at the edge of the hall, or when one of the doctors lowered his voice at the mention of Elias' real name. She treated him the same way she treated the elderly woman with the fractured hip down the corridor, or the boy in room 204 who clung to a stuffed dinosaur every time he got blood drawn, with quiet presence and unwavering calm. Elias, in turn, found himself watching her more than he meant to. He noticed the way she tucked her pen behind her ear when she charted, how she hummed under her breath while adjusting machines, how she knelt to tie the slipper of a patient with arthritis even when her knees popped in protest. And he noticed, too, how tired she sometimes looked when she thought no one was watching. One afternoon, after his pain medication left him adrift between clarity and sleep, he asked, Why are you still here, Clara? She looked up from where she was adjusting his blanket. What do you mean? You could work anywhere. You're not just competent, you care. That's rarer than people think. Clara's expression softened, though something flickered in her gaze, a guarded tenderness. I like being needed, not in a dramatic way, just in the way that matters quietly. It helps me forget what I can't fix. There was a pause, the kind that lingered just a little too long. Elias didn't fill it with charm or compliments. Instead, he asked, "What can't you fix?" Clara looked out the window. Debt, regret, a brother I haven't seen in 4 years, a life that got smaller while I was busy trying to be good. And somehow, instead of pulling away, Elias leaned in. Figuratively at first, then literally, he shifted in his bed, wincing slightly, as though he wanted to close the space between them. She stood, reaching for the bedside tray. "You need to eat something today, your weight's dropping." He stared at her. "So is yours." Clara stilled. For a moment something raw passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, just honest. Just two people seeing each other clearly in a room designed to keep everyone at a distance. 3 weeks into his recovery, Elias was transferred to a private rehab wing within the hospital. Clara's rotation was ending. She wasn't technically assigned to him anymore, but she found excuses to stop by, checking charts, walking past his door, asking the nurses if he was adjusting. He was. The therapist said he was compliant but disengaged. He moved through the motions of recovery with the efficiency of someone who had nothing left to return to. No visitors, no family, not even a suitcase of personal belongings. And yet whenever Clara entered the room, even for a few moments, he straightened in bed. He asked questions, he looked awake. "You've got a following here," she said one afternoon, leaning against the doorway. "The physical therapist thinks you're brooding on purpose." "Brooding is my baseline," Elias replied dryly. Clara grinned. "That explains why people look at you like they expect you to start monologuing about the meaning of life." He paused. "I used to give speeches, conferences, big ones." She tilted her head. "I believe it. I hated it. Then why do it?" He looked at her, eyes still bruised around the edges but clearer than they'd been. "Because I thought success would make me feel something. Instead, it just made the silence louder." Clara exhaled softly. Elias didn't break eye contact. "The only time I've felt something real in years was when I opened my eyes and asked who stayed with me, and somehow it was you." Clara blinked. Her heart shifted inside her chest like it had been nudged gently off its axis. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said. "Yes," Elias said, "you did." On her last official day assigned to his case, Clara found a small note tucked into her locker. It was simple, handwritten on a hospital order sheet folded in half. "Thank you for staying, E." She read it twice, then slid it back into her pocket and closed the locker with a quiet thud. What she didn't see was Elias later that evening, standing with effort beside the window in his room, watching the snow return. His body was healing slowly, but something else had changed too. For the first time in 4 years, Elias Wren felt the outline of a reason to stay in the world he had once tried to leave behind. And it had nothing to do with money or control or legacy. It had to do with a nurse who didn't ask who he was before giving him a part of herself. And how now he wanted to give something back. Elias Wren left the hospital on a Wednesday morning that looked more like November than December. Gray skies, cold light, no snow on the ground, but the promise of it held in the air like a secret. He walked slowly, supported by a cane and a physical therapist who had stopped giving him instructions days ago. Elias moved at his own pace, and people had learned to adapt to that. He didn't look back when the sliding doors closed behind him, but he didn't look forward either. No reporters waited outside, no family, just a dark sedan with tinted windows and a driver who avoided eye contact. Elias climbed in and closed the door with a wince, his ribs still sore beneath the wool of his coat. The city blurred past the window, strangers bundled in coats, buses huffing clouds of steam, a barista scribbling hearts on coffee cup lids, all of it moving unaware. And for the first time in his life, Elias didn't want to disappear back into silence. He wanted to understand what Clara saw in this world, why she stayed rooted in a hospital that asked everything and gave little, why she kept giving anyway. He didn't tell his team where he was going next, didn't answer emails. He spent 2 weeks in one of his lesser-known properties on the edge of the city, a glass and steel townhouse he barely remembered buying. He cooked for himself poorly. He walked laps around the courtyard. He listened to music he'd once loved and found it didn't move him. But he kept thinking of Clara. The way she looked when she was tired but trying not to show it. How her laugh came out as a surprised exhale like it had been coaxed from somewhere deep. The way she said his name once, not Mr. Wren, not sir, just Elias, when she was scolding him for trying to stand without help. He didn't know how to reach her. He had her full name, of course. His assistant had quietly offered to dig up every detail, but he refused. He didn't want research. He wanted to do it right. So he showed up at the hospital. Not as Elias Wren, billionaire and recluse, just as a recovering patient. Clara wasn't on the floor when he arrived. He waited in the lobby for an hour, then another, unsure what he was doing, unsure if it would even matter to her. But then she stepped out of the staff elevator, her hair in a messy twist, a coffee in one hand and a chart in the other. She didn't see him at first. She was mid-sentence, talking to another nurse, her laugh echoing faintly. When she finally looked up, she paused. Then she smiled. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music played. No one gasped. It was quiet and real, the kind of smile that made him feel like maybe he hadn't imagined their connection after all. "What are you doing here?" she asked, walking toward him. "I had a follow-up," he lied. She raised an eyebrow. He gave a soft shrug, "and I wanted to see you." That quieted her. For a second she looked unsure, like she'd built some small armor around herself in his absence. But then she nodded just once and gestured toward the hallway. "Come on," she said, "let's take a walk slowly." They walked the long corridor that wrapped around the hospital's east wing. Elias took it one slow step at a time, and Clara matched his pace without comment. "How's recovery?" she asked. "Boring, painful, unbearably quiet." She smiled faintly, "Sounds like healing." He looked at her then. "You're the first person I've wanted to talk to since the crash." Clara glanced at him, eyes unreadable. "You say that like I'm supposed to know what to do with it." "I don't want anything from you," Elias said. I remember what it felt like when you were near, like I wasn't completely alone, like it mattered that I came back." Clara looked away for a moment, then back at him. "You weren't alone, not really. I was just doing my job." "No," he said, you sat with me. You gave me blood. You stayed when no one else did." She stopped walking. "And then quietly, it mattered to me too, you know." Elias felt something unfurl in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" she asked. He looked down at the cane in his hand. "Because I've spent my life watching people change their tone when they find out. I didn't want that with you." "So what do you want?" she asked. Elias looked up, his voice soft but unwavering. "A second chance, not at business, not at headlines, at being someone real, with someone who makes me want to stay." Clara's eyes searched his. And then she said, "Walk with me a little longer." They met 3 more times that month. Once at a park where they sat on a bench and watched children throw leaves at each other. Once at a coffee shop where Clara insisted on paying and Elias let her. Once on her front steps, where he brought her a paperback he'd loved years ago and couldn't stop thinking she would too. They didn't touch, didn't kiss. But the space between them kept shrinking, as if something invisible was pulling them closer in a slow, inevitable orbit. Clara told him about her father who left when she was 10. Her first year in nursing school, when she almost dropped out because she couldn't afford textbooks. The night her mom slipped away while Clara held her hand and pretended she wasn't afraid. Elias told her about the company he built and the loneliness that came with it. The night of the crash when he'd been driving nowhere on purpose. The moment he woke up and knew, instinctively, that someone had chosen to keep him alive. Clara listened the way she always had, without interruption, without judgment. "You scare me," she said one night, quiet and unguarded. "Why?" "Because you see me," she whispered, "and I forgot what that felt like." Elias reached for her hand then, slowly, carefully. Their fingers met like the last page of a letter that had been waiting too long to be finished. The hospital Christmas party came and went. Clara didn't go. She didn't like loud rooms or punch in plastic cups. But when she got home that evening, there was a small box waiting on her porch. No name on the card, just a note. "For the nurse who gave more than blood, E." Inside was a silver charm shaped like a small heartbeat line. Clara held it in her palm for a long time, then curled her fingers around it and closed her eyes. She hadn't fallen in love quickly. It had grown the way snow blankets a street, quietly, persistently, until one day you wake and realize everything has changed color. She didn't know what would come next. But she knew she wasn't afraid anymore. And that somehow was enough. January settled over the city like a hush, muffling sound and stretching shadows, the kind of cold that made people walk faster and talk less. But in the small, evolving space between Clara and Elias, things were beginning to thaw. He started coming by the hospital again, not as a patient, but with quiet purpose. Sometimes he brought tea from the bakery around the corner, or books she'd once mentioned in passing, or just his presence, anchoring himself to a life that no longer felt as unreachable as it once had. Clara never asked for any of it. That was part of why he did it. "I don't know how to be normal," he admitted one evening, standing beside her at the nurse's station as she sorted patient files. Clara didn't look up. "What do you think normal looks like?" "Being able to sit in a room and not calculate what everyone wants from me." She smiled faintly, then finally turned to face him. "You do that with me." He shook his head. "You're the only one I don't." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she slid a file into the tray and stepped out from behind the desk. "Come with me," she said, motioning toward the stairwell. They climbed 3 flights in silence, her badge granting them access to the old rooftop terrace once used by staff on breaks, now mostly forgotten. A thin layer of frost edged the benches. The city spread out beneath them in a quiet sprawl, distant lights blinking like steady heartbeats. Elias stood beside her, hands in the pockets of his coat, watching steam rise from his breath. "This place used to scare me," she said quietly. "The height, the stillness, but after my mom passed, I started coming up here on my breaks. I'd just sit, let myself feel whatever I needed to feel. And now it feels honest." She turned to him, "like a place where I don't have to pretend I'm okay." Elias reached out, his gloved fingers brushing hers. "Then I'm glad you brought me here." They stood like that, not speaking, not touching more than fingertips, as the wind carried quiet between them. Later that week, Clara's brother called for the first time in nearly 5 years. She stared at his name on the screen, thumb hovering. When she answered, her voice barely held steady. "Hi." "Hey, Care," he said, using the nickname only he ever did. "I heard from Jen you donated blood to save someone." Clara leaned against the counter in her kitchen. "Yeah, it was an emergency. I didn't even know his name at the time." There was a pause, then "That sounds like you." She swallowed. "How are you?" "I'm trying. I got clean, been clean for a year." Tears prickled her eyes, unexpected and sudden. She sat down, letting the news land. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me. I didn't think you call." And just like that, something mended, not fully, not easily, but the crack that had lived between them for so long now held light. Later that night, she texted Elias. "Do you ever feel like things can begin again, even if you didn't ask them to?" He replied almost instantly. "Yes, but only since I met you." Clara wasn't sure when exactly her world began to change shape. It wasn't in sweeping gestures. It was small, daily things, waking up to a message from Elias, just a line from a poem or a quiet good morning. The way he started volunteering anonymously for a hospital tech initiative that helped families with outdated insurance systems navigate digital care. The way he began to soften not for her but for himself. He asked her once what scared her most. They were sitting in the front seat of his car, parked outside her apartment. Snow clung to the windshield. "Losing something I didn't even realize I'd started to love," she said. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "Then I hope I never become something you forget to notice." She turned to him slowly and kissed him for the first time. There was no rush in it, no hunger to possess or erase, just a deep, breathless stillness, like finding something familiar in a stranger's arms. Spring arrived on the edges of things, wet sidewalks, impatient buds on tree branches, the way people started smiling more on the streets. Clara found herself looking forward to each day, not because it was easy, but because it felt hers. She and Elias still lived in separate worlds in many ways. She worked long hours. He often retreated into silence, old habits hard to break, but they met in the spaces between: coffee on Tuesday mornings, walks after her shift, quiet dinners in his townhouse where she'd occasionally fall asleep on his shoulder before finishing her tea. They didn't call it love, not yet. But it felt like it. One night, Elias gave her a key. He didn't make a speech. He didn't even hand it to her directly. She found it on the table beside a handwritten note. "For whenever you want to come home." She stood there for a long moment, just holding it, and when she looked up, he was watching her from the kitchen, his eyes soft with hope. "I don't want to change you," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "You make me want to become someone worth staying for." And she walked to him, not because she had to, but because something in her heart had already begun to choose him. Clara didn't tell many people about Elias, not his last name, not his wealth, not the full story of how they met. But when she finally introduced him to her closest friend, the nurse raised an eyebrow after he left the cafe. "He's not what I expected." Clara smiled into her cup, neither was I. And that, she thought later that night, was the point. Elias hadn't saved her, she hadn't saved him. They had simply stayed, through blood, through silence, through grief and guilt and the slow, steady climb of healing. And now they were still staying, choosing one another not with certainty but with faith. The kind that builds something lasting. The summer came quietly. It didn't announce itself in sudden heat or bright fanfare but crept in with longer evenings, the hum of cicadas, the way light lingered on Clara's skin when she stood at Elias' kitchen window, watching the world dim. By then they had built something, not official, not flashy, but real. Elias had left the company board, not in anger, not in retreat, he simply walked away. The man who once controlled empires now spent his days slower, learning how to listen more than he spoke, how to stand beside someone without needing to lead. Clara kept working full-time, she'd never stopped. The hospital was still short-staffed, always would be, but she stayed because that's who she was. Because she knew the names of every patient who had no visitors, because she'd memorized the lull of monitors, because she still believed quiet care was its own kind of revolution. She didn't move in with Elias, not entirely. But her sweater lived on the back of his dining chair, her toothbrush in his drawer, her laughter in his rooms. They lived on the edge of each other's lives until one day they realized there was no edge left, just shared space. One warm Sunday morning, Clara stood barefoot on the balcony of Elias' townhouse, the hem of her cotton dress stirring in the breeze. She cradled a coffee mug between her hands, eyes half closed. Elias stepped behind her silently, his hand resting on the curve of her waist like it had belonged there for years. He didn't speak, she leaned back into him without needing a word. A full minute passed before she murmured, "Do you ever think about that night?" He didn't ask which one, he always knew what she meant. "All the time," he said, "not the crash, not the pain, just the part where I opened my eyes and asked who stayed with me, and it was you." Clara nodded slowly. "I didn't know you. I still remember the feel of your chart in my hands, no name, no details, just blood pressure and a line that read critical, unknown male." "I was so close to leaving," he said, quiet. "I didn't think anyone would notice." She turned to him, took his face in both hands. "But someone did, someone always does." Elias leaned into her touch, eyes closed. "I don't believe in fate, not the way people talk about it, but I believe in something. Whatever thread led you into my hospital room that night, I'll never stop being grateful for it." They stood like that for a while, the city stretching out below, life humming quietly. Later, Elias took her to a quiet coastal town 2 hours away. It wasn't a vacation, not really, just space. Time. They rented a small cabin with uneven floors and a porch swing. She brought books. He brought a half-written notebook of thoughts he hadn't shown anyone yet. It rained most of the week, and neither of them minded. One morning, after a long walk along the shore, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, damp hair falling over her shoulder. Elias knelt in front of her, something steady in his expression. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I didn't plan this, but I've loved you since the moment you told me you stayed because someone had to." Clara blinked, her hands stilled in her lap. "I'm not proposing," he continued. "Not in the way people expect. I'm just asking, can we keep staying through whatever comes next?" She smiled then, the kind of smile that warmed her whole face. "Yes," she said simply, "we already are." Years later, when strangers asked how they met, Clara never gave the full answer. She'd say it started with a hospital, a blood donation, and a man who didn't want to be found. And Elias would add, and a nurse who reminded me that life doesn't have to be loud to matter. Their life remained quiet, purposeful, built not on dramatic declarations but on morning coffees, walks to the market, arguments that always ended with someone reaching for the other. They never stopped choosing each other. Not because it was easy, but because something in them recognized the other from the very beginning, not through names or titles but through presence, through care. Through the single question that changed everything. Who stayed with me? And the answer always, I did.